Thank you. Nice, nice. We had a pretty good crowd in here this morning at the first service. They didn't start clapping. That was nice. I get up and start toe tapping and stuff. It's good. So we're on the fourth Sunday of this series, 5 W's of God, and we're talking about where. And I want you to think about this idea. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. God has left the building for a spirited game of hide and seek. The writer and former Mars Hill pastor, some of y'all have read some of his books. Mars Hill is a very conservative evangelical church. But the former pastor, Rob Bell, who started that church, had a change of heart some years back and has been in the process of transformation over the years and changing. He's changed and I think continuing to change how he sees the world, how he sees things, and his books reflect that change. They're kind of interesting. The one book that I've been reading is called "What We Talk About When We Talk About God," and it's an interesting book. I'm not saying that I completely agree with all that he says in either side of the coin, but I do like that idea of talking about how we talk about things. Because in here, if there's one thing that I think is our MO in 11:11 and 9:39 and 11:11, although we have not all sat down together and sort of said, yes, this is what we all think, but I do believe that one of our MOs is at least this idea of openness, of this idea of questioning. I had a great experience with questioning recently that really illustrated this whole concept, and it's real simple. I was at yoga class here. Some of the staff, we take yoga together twice a week. And Linda had called and lost her keys. But when she called, I'd said, well, where did you have them last, right? And she said, well, they were at the house, but now I'm at church. I said, well, you had to get to church, right? So you didn't lose your keys at the house. She says, no, but I had an extra set of keys, and I've lost them. Anyway, suffice it to say, two things had happened that day. I forgot the first thing, and the first thing was that she'd already lost her purse. But she left her purse at the restaurant where we'd both had lunch that day. And we called the restaurant, and they said the purse wasn't there, so we figured it was stolen. So that's how the day began, basically. I called up 2 different credit card places, canceled the credit card. The phone was gone, so I canceled the phone, put a stop on the phone. The purse was lost, so the driver's license and everything else was in there. So anxieties, tension, all that kind of stuff. She called a second time, again, to make sure. Did you check it? It's not a big restaurant. It's just a small little corner restaurant. They said, yeah, we checked everywhere. It's gone. I'm sorry. And we have a camera manager. We'll come back. We'll take a look at the camera, see maybe who took it, okay? So that's going on. And then, meanwhile, I'm doing the canceling. She's misplaced the keys, right? So I finally say, well, she has several people helping her. My younger son shows up over here, and he's helping her find the keys. It turns out that the keys were in her gym bag from the yoga class. When she sat in the car, she'd just thrown the keys to the side because you don't need the keys to start the car once you're in the car, right? You all have cars like that. Some of us have cars. You don't need the key just to get in, right? So it was in the gym bag. My question was, did you look? And her answer was, yes. Of course I did. And of course my son's answer was, Dad, we both looked. So we go back over to the restaurant. She walks in. Purse is sitting under the cash register where you put a purse when it's been lost or left behind, right? It's sitting under there. Did you look? All the staff look at each other and went like, yeah, we all looked. It wasn't there. All that's to simply say is that I think one of the things that I'm finding in some of the book groups that we have here with different groups and the stuff that we read and some of the stuff that we do here is that we never get past the first question, right? We tend to accept the first response, the first answer. We never ask ourselves, but what if? And then we never say, but then why not? And then we don't keep pushing why. Or what does that mean? We sort of stop at first questions. We sort of presume answers. So we have an MO in here which says we're open, but that also there's sort of secondary MO. We got new pins that are coming out and for signing these cards that for some reason didn't get printed today. But the pin will say on it, besides 939 1111, it says all the answers questioned. Because that's part of our MO. How can we truly know what we think if we don't think about what we think? I mean, thinking is a process. It's not a static answer. It's an investigative process. It's a curious journey. So when Rob Bell wrote this book, I thought it was really interesting because he has this thing that he says. He talks about this experience and you've had this experience where someone came up to him and they were talking about this horrible thing that had happened to him that week, and things were just looking dire, and his life and his family's life, everything was in turmoil, and Rob's listening to the story, but what Rob says he remembers is that the guy talks about at the end how everything just kind of finally came together. It finally worked out, and people showed up to help at the last minute, and the doctor was able to figure out what the problem. I mean, all these things sort of fell into place, and his friend looked at him and said, God just showed up. And Rob was smiling and thinking like, well, I'm glad, I'm so happy. And then he stops and he says, what? And he thinks in his head, no, wait a minute. He didn't negate the person's experience then and there, of course, but he left that moment. And he remembered all the other times that experience has happened. And you've had those experiences too. I've had them where I sat down and talked with somebody because our family went through addiction. Our oldest child was dealt with addiction, severe addiction, and we were fortunate. We were able to see the other side of that. But sometimes I'll end up just talking to people. They'll just start opening up to me and start sharing it, and I'll start sharing back with them our experience, and they're just feeling so comforted. And then they smile and say, "This was such a God moment." And I don't want to go, nah, it's just coincidence. I don't really believe that either. But I also don't believe it was a singular God moment. Because you see, like Rob Bell, that starts throwing all sorts of things into question, right? Why did that bombing happen in Bangladesh? Why did those people get killed last night in Baghdad? Why did all of those folks get killed because of that one guy in Pulse Club in Orlando? Why does that happen? Why did this child get diagnosed with brain cancer? Why is my brother struggling with this? I mean, all of those things. And the reality is that we do tend to live life static, right? We do tend to just kind of presume. We just live through life presumptuously. And things go well. And if you're a prosperity gospel kind of folks, then you know it's because God is looking out after you because you're doing the right stuff until something happens. But things good happen all the time. I'm blessed, you're blessed, we're all blessed in so many different ways, and then something falls apart. Where's God? Has God left the building? Was God not there to begin with, or did God just decide? You only have a couple options, right? Either we're not doing something right, or God is not there at all, or God is really cruel and fickle. There's some really awkward options. But it's a scary place to go sometimes, especially if things are all right. It's a scary place to go. And my point that I'd like to suggest is that we have to stop being static. We have to stop living life as though things are just fine the way they are, and things we just kind of hold to the plow and just kind of go straight. We have to open up. I've been reading this guy lately. Some of you all read a lot of his stuff before. John O'Donohue. I heard an interview with John O'Donohue. It happened 2 years ago, but I recently heard it with Krista Tippett, the woman that does On Being, which is a great NPR show if you get a chance to listen to it on, I think, Friday nights or Saturday night. Anyway, she was interviewing him. He died in 2008. He's a wonderful Celtic philosopher, theologian, poet, and I love what he says. Because she's asking, Krista Tippett interviewed him about his latest book, which was called Anam Cara. That was when he wrote Anam Cara. And she was asking him about that book, Soul Friend, and she says, well, what is that about this book? And he said, it's really about landscape. And she interrupted him, and she said, landscape. And he said, yeah, landscape. And she said, what do you mean? She said, no, wait, I know where you live. You live in West Ireland. She said, I know, I've seen pictures of West Ireland. I've never been there, but I know about the history. And Cromwell, the English general, and when he came to Ireland and defeated the Irish in the 16th century and brought over the English landowners and said, you guys can buy up all this good eastern half of Ireland because it's rich and stuff. And then he looked at the remaining Irish, and the famous quote when he said, you got two choices, you can go to hell or you can go to Connacht. And everyone who lived in Ireland knew there wasn't much of a choice. I mean, there really wasn't much of an option there. And she said that to him, and he says, well, there's truth to that statement. I mean, if you're a farmer, if you live off the land, it's going to be really hard in the west of Ireland because all it is rock. It's windswept ground, hardly any trees, and it's rock and more rock and cliffs and lots of wind coming off the coast. And then he stopped and he said, but that's one way of looking at it. But he said, I think we have to change the way that we see. There's an inner landscape. And then he said to her, he said this question that I would pose to you. How many of us get up in the morning, for example, and we get ready for our day, and we head out to our destination? He said, now that's one way of looking at it. You get in your car, you get on the bus, you get on a train, but the landscape is dead. It doesn't exist because it only serves one point, one purpose, to get you from point A to point B. So it's not even there. He said that's pretty much the way most of us operate. We are completely disconnected. And he says, and isn't that an irony? Because in reality, all of us are longing for connection. It's probably one of the greatest truths about us. We will put on all sorts of masks to try to get us there. Addictions, jobs, ambition, relationships. He said we wear all sorts of masks for connection. But we lack the one thing that connection is all about. It's how we choose to see. So he said the other way that you could choose to see is that when you get up in the morning, not just with gratitude, but you are open. Every single thing that you pass or that you encounter, whether it's the coffee in the morning, the person you are with in the morning, the people you see along the street, the trees that you pass, the corner and the stop sign that you come to, every single thing that you pass by is as alive and has as much value or more worth and value than you have for yourself. He said, if you see with the second set of eyes, he said, suddenly everything has become holy. Suddenly you are open. You are present to what's always present with you, but you pass by. Rumi had this wonderful phrase. What was Rumi's quote? He said, that which I seek, or he said, that which you seek is seeking you. Your task then is not to seek for love. And let's open that up to what love really means here. Your task is not to seek for connection, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. That's a spiritual practice right there, right? The task is to simply look for all the ways in which we have built walls against connection. It's both challenging and it's also inviting. About 15 years ago, I went to Ireland. I've told you about some of this story. I went to Ireland to do a cycling trip. One of the things that I discovered when I started taking walks and jogging in college, jogging was harder to experience this, but when I would take long walks in college and seminary, I was reading this book by this guy, some of you know, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Thich Nhat Hanh. Some of y'all know him, Vietnamese writer, Buddhist writer. He wrote this wonderful book. He's got all sorts of books, Be Here Now, all these great books about being present. But he wrote this little simple book back in the 80s that was entitled Walking. And all it was about basically meditative walking. It was basically saying the same thing that I had just described for John O'Donohue saying, but he said it in a simply unpretentious way. It's just focusing on your steps and focusing on your breathing and trying to let go of things. For me, what I discovered in practicing that was how alive the world became, how much stuff I started to see, how many things I started to experience simply by being present. So I went through this midlife crisis, I guess it was, at 39, 40. I guess that's what that was, and decided I was going to connect to my roots. You hear that a lot, right? Going to go over to Europe finally and connect with my roots. I was going to go back to Ireland where my father was born. And I decided that the best way to do that would be a cycling trip. Not because at the time spiritually I decided I'm going to connect with everything and everything is sacred and I'm going to be open to it. It's because I was 40 and I was going to prove I still was physically capable of doing something like that. And so I had trained for it and took my bike over and took a pack on the bike, and I camped out a lot of the time, and I stayed at B&Bs. And it was a 600-mile trip, and I did it for about 21 days. And it was great fun. I've told different stories from some of that experience. I was surprised by what I encountered. Some of them overwhelmingly distasteful. If you've ever driven past a dairy farm, you don't want to walk or ride past one because you'll smell it for an hour and a half. You know, it doesn't go away. That's why at 60 miles an hour, it only lasts for a few minutes. But at 8 miles an hour, it's there for a long time, and you're taking deep breaths of it. But the other things that you'd see, just the rock formations themselves, the tiny flowers that just cropped up out of those granite stones in defiance of the terrain, you know, just the beautiful stuff that you'd see that you pass by so often. And then I ended up in this wonderful town that I think I've shared it before. I spent a week or 5 days in Glencullimkill, which is Irish for St. Columba, that was named after him. It's on the far northwestern shore in County Donegal, and it's a little peninsula town at the tip of the peninsula. And I rode all evening and then stayed overnight in a little town called Killybeag, and then the next morning early was Sunday morning, and I got up at 5 in the morning and rode for another 3 or 4 hours and came into Glencullimkill. And Glencullimkill is about 500, maybe 400 people, maybe fewer. It's your classic little Irish village. It's row of shops on one side of the one street that goes through town and curves over a hill and then goes down, winds through hills to a little coastal area where people take their holiday for vacation on the beach. There's a little beach house there. It winds through the little town, shops on one side, 3 pubs, one at each end, one in the middle, and then a Catholic church right across the street for the cemetery. And that's pretty much the town. Then little houses that dotted the hillside. And as I rode through town, I couldn't help but notice that the church, Sunday morning mass was happening apparently. It was about 9 o'clock, I guess, or so. The pubs were still open. And people were standing outside the pub doors looking across the street at the Catholic church, except for me when I came riding through. And then I looked across and I noticed there were 3 or 4 or 5 guys standing, I think there may have been one woman, standing outside the Catholic church door. And I thought, wow, it's crowded in there. It's a small village. So I got to the bed and breakfast and I unloaded stuff and visited for a moment. And it was about 30 minutes later and I looked over and there were still people standing there at the door. And I asked the hostess, her name was Miss Lenny, and I asked Miss Lenny, I said, why are all the folks out there? Is Mass pretty popular? Is it a special day? And she says, oh, no. She says the church is empty. I said, empty? She says, well, no, the father's in there and some acolytes and maybe a few of the family members. They're there too. And she said, but the others aren't going in. And I said, well, why aren't they going in? She says, well, that's all the faith they got. They can't get across the street, and those that do can't get in the door. But you can see that they had at least enough to get them across the street. Think about the poor souls that are still inside the pubs. And I laughed, you know, but I thought, what a strange thing. They really were just standing at the door, just standing outside the pub. Turns out that I was there for to learn some Irish language. It turns out that the owner of the Irish Cultural Center was also the owner of Biddy's Pub. And I found that out because I was complaining to the guy at the bar after class that evening. We went out and got some Guinness and stuff, some of the students. And we were sitting there, and I was complaining about the sheep in the road because there were sheep in the road when you're riding around. I was just making a joke. I said, yeah, I got to wait for the sheep to get out of the way. And he looks over at me, and he says, you got a problem with sheep? And I said, well, no, but I mean, they're just kind of slow and in the way. And he says, did you see the sign on the side of the pub? And I said, well, yeah, I thought that was kind of funny. It said, don't buy the sheep beer and expect them to buy it back. And I said, I said, yeah, that's kind of funny. He said, they're my sheep. Turns out he's a shepherd as well. He runs the cultural center, he's the pub owner, and he's a shepherd. And so, I mean, I just was getting deeper and deeper into it the whole time that I was there, right? Because that's kind of what's fun for locals to do that. And so we were talking, and we were just talking about America and different things. And he says, so you're over here for what reason? And I said, well, I'm trying to get reconnected to my roots, which is such a cliche thing to say. And he knows it. He looked at me and he says, well, I can tell you one thing. You're likely to be disappointed. And I said, why? And he says, well, let me tell you something. And he told me that story that I've told in here before. That's where I first heard the St. Patrick story. He had the magic finger. Some of you might remember that. He came down to Ireland. He was telling me this story, and he says, St. Patrick was running around the place, and he says, and he was a saint. And I said, okay, yeah, I know. He said, well, he was running around the place. I said, yeah, well, he was dead. I said, okay. He's a saint. He's dead. He says, all right, you're following me. So he says, so St. Patrick's walking around, and he's pointing his finger at things and looking for good people who don't care about stuff. And already I'm getting the point of where this is going. And he says, so he can't find a one. No matter where he goes and he points his finger, things turn to gold and people grab it up and walk away. He can't find one good soul who doesn't care about stuff, but is kind and motivated by kindness. And finally, he gives up on the people. He said he just gives up and he goes to Patrick, and that's the hill down the road. And that's where apparently he stood last. He says he stands at the top of Patrick, and he's about to disappear when a boy comes whistling up the hill, and he thinks, that's been the mistake. I've been asking adults. They got all this baggage and greed and stuff, but a child is innocent. And so the boy gets up on the top of the hill, and he says, St. Patrick points his finger to a stone, turns it to gold, and the boy just smiles and stares at it. And St. Patrick says, do you want it? And the boy says, no, sir, I don't. And St. Patrick thinks he better be sure that this is what he's looking for. So he turns a few other objects to gold. And Seamus looks at me and he says, the boy looks up and says, don't want that either. St. Patrick thinks he's finally found what he was looking for, he said. And that's when St. Patrick looks at the boy and says, if you're sure there's nothing you want, and the boy grabs his hand and says, I want your finger. And then Seamus looks at me and he says, well, maybe that's what you need. And I looked at him and I said, is that an insult or what? And he said, you think about it a minute. And it didn't really register with me what he was saying for some time until after I'd left and got back home. That night, after finishing up with class, or the next night, we came back and people were singing at the pub. And it was interesting because there were locals. It wasn't like we brought in musicians to entertain any of the tourists. It was just local people. And what was interesting was how they supported one another. They say the pub is the community center for a lot of these small towns. But as people would get up to sing, the kinds of songs they would sing would be patriotic songs because of the struggles that they'd had, the troubles during the early 20th century and beyond. But they were also romantic songs. And every time someone would sing, you always got this sense of two things happening: being lost and being found. Because the songs always had this tone of longing. And the community, after they would sing, always had this sense of belonging. But one woman whose name was Sally, she was a young woman, every night for 4 nights until the last night before our class was over, she was a local resident, but every night they'd look over and they'd say, "Come on, Sally, you know you want to sing." And Sally would always go, "No, I'm not going to sing tonight," and she'd sit back in the back, and everybody else would sing songs and tell stories and stuff, and she just kept saying no. And finally, this 4th night, they said, "Sally, you want to sing?" And she said, I don't know. And someone kind of gave a tone, fair. Come on, Sally, come on. And she stood up and she sang this song. And it just had the most haunting tone. I only know a little bit of it. It goes like this. Feravata snoroella, Feravata snoroella, Feravata snoroella, Ange andrentu, Ange andicto. And she went through 4 verses of that. And, people were weeping, and then they were applauding afterward. And I asked someone what the song was. And they said, well, it's just called The Boatman. Feravata, the boatman. And it's about a boatman who had promised his love to a young woman and then gone off to sea. Did he leave? Did the sea take him? What's happened? Where is he? And the verses all struggle with this longing. And then it always ends with, I'm blessed, and may you be blessed. It's the strangest song. But everyone would smile and they applauded afterwards. That night, as I made my way home, I saw something kind of strange. I've told you about this one before. I saw a guy in the street that I thought looked like he was a zombie. It was not your typical, this guy had been drinking too much or whatever. This guy really had the appearance of having this sort of deathly look about him. And when I shared it with Seamus, the next day, he was kind of laughing and saying, well, Tom, he says, he doesn't sound like anyone we know, and we know the dead people that walk on our streets. We know them all by name, and that doesn't sound like him. And he kept pushing at it. And finally, the morning I was leaving, he pointed a guy out across the street who was sitting at a bus stop, and he's wearing the same clothing that I saw this guy in. And he says, is that the dead guy you saw? And I said, well, yeah, but he looks so much more alive now. And he says, well, that's Big John. And he can't talk because he had cancer, oral cancer, and he lost his tongue. He signs, but you can't sign in the midst of the dark now, can you? So what you saw might have given you a bit of discomfort, but he's a good man. And then he kind of went across the street and started talking to him. And as I was leaving and packing up my bike, I looked at Miss Linny, and she says, well, now, didn't you have a good time? And I said, I had a great time. I learned how to say a few phrases in Irish, and I really learned a lot about culture, and I got songs in my head. She said, and isn't Seamus O'Clarity, isn't he a strange and fun fella? And I said, yeah, he was a lot of fun to get to know. And he said, well, now, so you're heading back to work? And I never told her what I did, because I've told you all before here, that's an awkward, sort of risky kind of thing to go, well, I'm a minister. Next thing you know, you got confessionals, you got all sorts of stuff happening. And I looked at her, and she said, so what will you be going back to? And I just let it out. I said, well, I'm going to be going back to church. I'm a minister. And she says, saints, isn't that amazing? And I said, what? And she said, well, it's a God moment. I said, what are you talking about? She says, Seamus never told you. I said, well, no. Well, that's because you never told him. Seamus gave up the priesthood. He was a priest, a Catholic priest, for a number of years before moving out here to Glencullenkill and taking over the cultural center in the pub. I don't know what to make of all that, except that I've discovered with John O'Donohue and others, and maybe Rumi as well, that there are so many things that I put in my way that prevent me from experiencing what's already there. And that may be the challenge we have to face as we begin to, as we explore just where is God? Just who or what is God? Maybe the challenge is for us to simply remove all the barriers that are preventing us from experiencing the connection that's already there. Amen.